Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over 3 of some of the worst and most grueling disasters in history. One was natural, one was man-made, and one was a combination of both. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On January 18, 1977, at exactly 6:09 a.m., a commuter train from Mount Victoria began its daily journey toward the urban sprawl of Sydney, Australia. On it, close to 470 passengers found themselves packed into wooden-bodied carriages that had been hastily converted from the original compartments to a more open-plan layout. Then, at the front of the train, electric locomotive 4620 led the way toward Granville station, which was the final stop before passengers reached Sydney. With ongoing construction near the station, speed restrictions have been enforced to ensure safety. But beneath the surface, years of deferred maintenance, cost-cutting, and insufficient inspection had allowed serious structural defects to accumulate. So as the train approached Granville at approximately 8:10 a.m., now with around 300 passengers aboard, without warning, the locomotive violently derailed. The train then erupted into chaos as metal ground against metal, sending showers of sparks and debris into the air. It then slammed into the supports of the Bold Street Bridge overhead, and this impact was catastrophic, instantly tearing apart stanchions and sending chunks of concrete and twisted steel plunging downward onto the tracks below. In a horrifying instant, the lead passenger carriage was ripped open by an overhead support pole. The train then came to a stop with several carriages trapped precariously beneath the severely damaged bridge structure. Then, before any survivors could fully comprehend the nightmare unfolding around them, the weakened bridge, bearing an immense 570 tons, gave way. With an earth-shaking roar, it collapsed onto carriages 3 and 4, instantly compressing them and crushing the passengers inside. Within minutes of the crash, a vast and highly coordinated rescue effort began assembling at the scene. Everyone from police officers to firefighters, ambulance crews, doctors, nurses, engineers, and railway workers converged swiftly, racing against time to provide assistance to victims. Their initial progress, however, was significantly hindered by the challenging topography of the area. Emergency personnel were forced to quickly improvise, constructing makeshift ladders and temporary stairs just to access the wreck and tracks below. Then, further complicating their efforts was the realization that the collapsed bridge's immense weight made immediate rescue extremely difficult. The massive concrete segments crushing the train cars were far beyond the lifting capability of any crane available at the scene. Then, as first responders struggled to reach the trapped survivors, the scene descended even further into chaos. News of the accident spread rapidly throughout the region, attracting not only brave, concerned volunteers who were trying to help, but also an unsettling number of curious specters drawn by morbid curiosity. Within just a short time, thousands of sightseers flocked to the scene, crowding the rescue operation area and severely obstructing the essential pathways needed by rescuers and ambulances. And shockingly, some spectators went to disturbing lengths to gain a closer look, even disguising themselves as rescue personnel to infiltrate restricted areas. In fact, at one point, more than 250 officers who could have been working to rescue survivors were assigned exclusively to crowd management duties. Despite these conditions though, rescuers continued to squeeze themselves into impossibly tight and unstable spaces within the crushed train carriages. But as they went further, they encountered devastation unlike anything they'd ever faced. Survivors were pinned beneath tons of debris, their bodies contorted into impossible positions and calling out in desperation. The scale of the destruction inside the impacted carriages was horrific. Seats had been flattened, windows were shattered, and metal was warped beyond recognition. For some deceased passengers, the weight of the collapsed bridge had compressed the train cars to the point that their heads and shoulders were crushed below the level of their knees. Meanwhile, others sat motionless, frozen in positions they'd held since the moment the bridge came down. Even more horrifyingly, as the effort continued, a new and sinister threat soon emerged, one that first responders had not anticipated. As survivors were pulled from the wreckage, many who had spoken lucidly and who had seen moments away from freedom suddenly collapsed within seconds of being pulled from the debris. Some lost consciousness, while others went into cardiac arrest as their bodies shut down before the rescuers' eyes. This was a phenomenon that few understood at the time, but one that would become a defining lesson of the Granville disaster. This was a condition called crush syndrome. This occurs when prolonged pressure on muscle tissue leads to a dangerous buildup of harmful substances. As long as the victims remain trapped, the weight of the debris prevents these from spreading, but when the pressure is suddenly lifted, the bloodstream is flooded with things like potassium, acids, and broken down muscle proteins. These then overwhelm the kidneys, heart, and lungs in as little as an instant or gradually over a period of hours. And without immediate medical intervention, it often leads to death. And the end result was that several victims of the Granville crash succumbed to crush syndrome in the arms of the very people who fought and risked their own lives to save them. Rescuers could only watch as the effects of the condition unfolded before them, leaving little time for response. This would ultimately lead to widespread changes in the way emergency medicine approached crush injuries, but for the victims that day, there wasn't much that could be done. As this was going on, further dangers emerged as the operation to extract survivors continued. The weight of the collapsed bridge continued to be a serious issue. Any shift in the rubble could mean further collapses, further injuries, and further deaths. And in fact, at one point, a slight shift caused a further collapse, trapping 2 emergency workers and crushing a portable generator. The train had also been carrying tanks of liquid petroleum gas, which was a standard feature that was used in the winter for heating the carriages. When the crash occurred, the impact tore open the cylinder, spreading gas and fumes throughout the disaster scene. And so some passengers who were otherwise mildly injured in the crash were found dead after being overcome by the noxious fumes. Rescuers were also further hampered by this, as powered saws and other cutting equipment couldn't be used for fear of causing an explosion. As the hours stretched on, the rescue transitioned into a recovery. The last body was removed from the wreckage 31 hours after the crash, and by then, the scene was quiet. The crowds that had gathered that day had begun to thin, and emergency personnel, their faces etched with exhaustion and grief, stood in silence as the final victim was carried away. The effort was over, but for those who had worked tirelessly through the night, the emotional toll would linger long after the physical work was done. In the aftermath, as debris was cleared and the scale of the loss became undeniable, questions arose, like how could this have happened and could it have been prevented? The search for answers began almost immediately as investigators worked methodically through the wreckage and an official inquiry into the disaster began. Early suspicions fell on the train's crew, with some speculating that the train had been speeding to make up for lost time and others believing that the driver miscalculated the approach to the curve. The initial evidence, however, pointed elsewhere. The damage to the locomotive and carriages was inconsistent with excessive speed, and the wreckage told a different story of structural failure and neglected maintenance. The railway infrastructure at Granville had actually long been in a state of disrepair. It was then discovered that the tracks had widened beyond the standard gauge, allowing the locomotive's wheels to slip free of their intended path. And worse still, the section where the derailment occurred had already been the site of multiple past incidents. A locomotive in 1967 and a loaded coal wagon in 1975 had both derailed at nearly the exact same location. But despite the troubling history, no corrective measures had ever been taken. Further investigation revealed that the rails had also been inadequately secured to the railroad ties due to staffing shortages and deferred maintenance. Over time, the vibrations of passing trains had worsened instability, weakening the structural integrity of the rail. So on that fateful morning, it had only taken one unlucky moment for the system to collapse entirely. But the failure didn't end with the tracks. The Bold Street Bridge itself was also a ticking time bomb. Originally designed to support a much lighter load, the bridge had undergone modifications that significantly increased its weight. Concrete had been added to level its road surface with adjoining streets, almost tripling its original design weight. This additional burden had been overlooked in safety assessments, and when the train struck the supports, the weakened structure simply couldn't withstand the impact. In the end, the inquiry then laid bare the systemic failures that led to the Granville disaster. It wasn't one mistake nor one moment of misjudgment, but a culmination of years of neglect, cost-cutting measures, and ignoring warnings. No individual was held directly responsible, yet the failure stretched all the way to the upper levels of the Public Transport Commission. Every failure compounded upon the last until the disaster became unavoidable. Public outcry following the findings prompted swift governmental action. These crucial changes, however, came at a great human cost. Of the passengers and crew on board at the time of the crash, 83 died and 213 would be injured. In recent years, though, the official number was changed to 84 after the discovery of a pregnant woman among those who perished that day. And the Granville crash remains the worst railway disaster in Australian history. The ground beneath southern Iceland shuddered awake on June 8, 1783, sounding and feeling as if the earth itself was being torn apart. It began with a deep rumble beneath the feet of concerned citizens, building into a thunderous crack that literally split the landscape wide open. From these fissures, columns of molten rock erupted into the air, creating a red-orange glow that could be seen for miles. Walls of fire then surged upward, while rivers of lava poured out, swallowing entire fields and farms in their path. Ash also rained down in thick, suffocating sheets, and the stench of sulfur filled the air. For those who lived near the fissure, it was as though the end of the world had arrived. John Stein Grimson, a Lutheran priest who lived in the area, watched this unfold as the inner earth spewed out over the mountains in front of him. As a man of God devoted to his community, John had already lived through a lifetime of hardships. The early 18th century had not been kind to Iceland, as leprosy was common and a smallpox epidemic had wiped out a quarter of the population, many of which belonged to his congregation. And in fact, he was no stranger to these eruptions either, as was the case for many of those who chose to call southern Iceland home. Living in that region meant sharing the surroundings with Laki, which is a long fissure that bisects a mountain called Laki and runs through a volcanic system that includes 2 other volcanoes. This fissure is around 25 kilometers long and is dotted with more than 130 volcanic vents. Up to that point, Laki had been dormant for centuries, but its awakening would devastate not only Iceland, but much of the northern hemisphere. When the fissure began its eruption that day in June 1783, John's small parish was directly in its path. The ground then cracked open with roars so loud they were described as deafening. Fountains of lava then shot as high as 1,400 meters as thick smoke blotted out the sun and turned day into night. John quickly gathered his congregation inside the church as tremors shook the ground and the lava inched closer. Then, leading his parishioners in prayer, he held what would later be called the Fire Mass, earning him the nickname the Fire Priest. And miraculously, almost as if a divine force had intervened, the lava flow stopped just short of the church. Others would credit the terrain for this, but to John and his followers, it was proof that their prayers had worked. Despite this early reprieve though, the Laki fissure would continue its constant eruption for the next 8 months. During that time, it would unleash an estimated 42 billion tons of basaltic lava and pump toxic gases high into the atmosphere, devastating Iceland and leaving a terrifying mark on the world beyond. The eruption also released enormous amounts of sulfur dioxide and hydrofluoric acid. This would end up being 80 times more than what was produced by the eruption of Mount St. Helens, which poisoned the air and soil. As a result, crops withered and livestock that grazed on contaminated grass died by the dozens. As all of this was going on, John would go in to document everything in rich detail and describe the suffering cattle he saw. And because of the sulfur dioxide and hydrofluoric acid, their snouts and feet turned yellow and raw and their bones softened. Then later when they died, the desperately hungry locals would butcher the cow only to be turned away by taste so foul and bitter that not even those starving to death could bear it. And the human toll was no less grim. In John's district, the population dwindled from 613 to just 93 due to starvation, illness, and mass relocation. Dysentery, hair loss, and heart palpitations were just some of the symptoms caused by the noxious gases being emitted from Laki as people unknowingly drank poisoned water and inhaled toxic fumes. And tragically, in 1784, John's wife passed away from kidney disease, which he attributed to the lingering effects of the eruption. But although he was grief-stricken by the death of his wife, he remained dedicated to helping his parishioners. Using his medical training, he treated the sick and provided shelter to the homeless. Despite all John was doing in his local community though, the devastation of the Laki fissures spread across the globe. A rare high-pressure zone set over Iceland, creating winds that gusted to the southeast. Ash and gases carried by the wind then blanketed Europe, turning sunsets blood red and poisoning the air. This cloud blew into Denmark, Norway, before moving on to Prague, Berlin, Paris, and then Great Britain. And this fog lingered in England for months, killing an estimated 23,000 people. Apparently the haze was so thick that ships were stranded in port because they couldn't see enough to navigate the waters. Farms also failed, rivers flooded, and temperatures soared, causing severe thunderstorms that produced hailstones large enough to kill cattle grazing the poisonous fields. The winter of early 1783 and early 1784 was also one of the harshest on record too, as 28 days of continuous frost were seen. Just the extreme weather alone was enough to cause an additional 8,000 deaths in the United Kingdom. Meanwhile, in France, famine worsened the growing poverty and unrest, and it's believed that these conditions actually contributed to the French Revolution just a few years later. Then, across the Atlantic, the eruption's reach was even felt in America. That winter actually froze the Chesapeake Bay, as New England experienced its longest period on record of below zero temperatures, and New Jersey received its largest accumulation of snow at the time. Heavy snowstorms also buried the South, and temperatures were so cold that the Mississippi River froze over in New Orleans, and ice floes were seen in the Gulf of Mexico. Simultaneously, before the eruption, Japan was in the early years of the Great Tenmei famine, and the toxic cloud from Iceland only made things worse. When it was over, the famine's death toll came close to reaching 1 million people, and it's believed many of these deaths can be attributed in part to the conditions brought on by the Laki eruption. Back in Iceland for John, the eruption was both a test of faith and a defining moment. He chronicled the disaster in 2 detailed accounts, which preserved the facts and also told of the raw emotional impact the eruption had on those who endured it. These writings would later become invaluable to volcanologists studying the eruption, as they offered rare insight into both the physical and human toll of the event. According to John, when Laki finally went dormant again and its poisonous gases cleared the area, the landscape left behind was almost otherworldly. Jagged lava fields stretched across the lands as the red-orange lava hardened into blackened mounds. Entire valleys were buried under layers of molten rock, and the rivers ran dark with ash and dead fish. The once beautiful green pastures were left barren, but more devastating than anything else was that about 20% of Iceland's population was wiped out. In the end, Laki was one of those catastrophic volcanic events in recorded history. Such a cataclysmic event isn't out of the question today either, and the devastation of a similar eruption would be just as far felt, if not more. As ruinous as the eruption and its fallouts were, however, the farmers returned to their poisoned fields, communities rose again, and life at some point simply became a new normal. And today, the blackened fields of Laki still bear the scars of the eruption as a frozen record of fire and fury that once reigned across the landscape. The ship known as the SS Adela was a marvel of mid-19th century engineering, built to dominate the busy trade routes of Australia's southern coast. With an iron hull and a single screw propeller, the steamer measured nearly 200 feet or 60 meters in length and 26 feet or 8 meters at its widest point. It also had these new watertight bulkheads riveted to the hull, which were touted as an innovative safeguard against flooding. For 3 years, the Adela had sailed the route between Adelaide and Melbourne, and the ship's reputation was further enhanced by the skill and caution of its only captain, Hugh McEwen. In fact, in 39 voyages along this route, there had never been a safer ship. So while it carried lifeboats and emergency equipment, the notion of ever needing them seemed absurd given the ship's impeccable record and Captain Hugh's experience at the helm. Under a clear sky in the early hours of August 5th, 1859, the Adela departed Port Adelaide with every sign that this would be a smooth, routine, and uneventful voyage. Aboard the ship were 81 passengers and 28 crew members, along with valuable cargo stored in the holds. Among these goods were 93 tons of copper destined for Melbourne, flour intended for the Victorian goldfields, an assortment of general merchandise, and several horses, including 4 prized racehorses carefully secured in their stalls. As the journey got underway, the mix of families, workers, and travelers gathered to mingle on deck and chatted while enjoying the crisp sea air. A little while later, during a quick stop at Semaphore, the ship picked up 3 more passengers and 1 crewman, raising the total number of those aboard to 113. As night fell, the Adela pressed onward, and by midnight the ship had covered around 100 miles. And although a dense fog began to settle over the waters, Captain Hugh's calculations placed the ship well on course to reach its destination of Cape Northumberland by dawn. Unbeknownst to him, however, a strong inshore current was subtly and steadily drawing the Adela off course. Near what today is known as Carpenter Rocks, beneath the dark waters, was a jagged reef that was notorious among seafarers, and oblivious to this hidden danger, the passengers had long since gone to their quarters while the crew carried out their nighttime duties. At around 4 a.m., there was a slight bump that was the first brush with the rocks, but the ocean swell that followed pushed and lifted the Adela in such a way that it went right up over top of the rocks and then slammed back down onto them. This then caused the ship to keel over until it lay broadside against the rocks. In those first chaotic moments, orders were shouted to clear the ship, but confusion and terror spread in the darkness. Within 15 minutes, the Adela's celebrated watertight bulkheads, which ironically were designed to ensure safety, became a fatal weakness. The waves that kept rolling in caused the bulkheads to give way, causing the ship to snap into 3 sections. The funnel, which is the big chimney-looking thing, then toppled, crushing a lifeboat on its descent and sending ropes and chains whipping through the air, sweeping passengers and crew into the ocean. The horses were also flung overboard, and the people clinging to the midship section were swept away almost instantly as the strong current pulled them away. In the next few hours on the bow section, women and children huddled together, holding tight to whatever they could grab onto. More than 40 survivors also clung to the top rear deck, where the weight of the copper below provided an anchor of stability. The sea, however, continued to tear away railings and timbers, leaving the wreckage precariously exposed. Amid the wreck as well, cries for help were shouted, only to be drowned out by the sound of the water. Efforts were also made to fire signal rockets to attract the attention of the Cape Northumberland lighthouse some 13 miles away, but they were too damp to ignite. A couple of hours later, as the slightest amount of dawn began to light up the sky, the crew could see the coast in the distance and began to make plans to reach the shore. Right around this time, another ship could be seen in the distance, which was known as the Havila, but despite the frantic efforts of the remaining crew to ring the ship's bell, it passed without ever noticing them. Then, later that day, one of the ship's lifeboats was spotted, and one crew attempted to swim out to it with a line tied to his waist. He would end up reaching the boat, but the line broke, and he spent the rest of the day trying desperately to prevent it from being washed out to sea. Finally, the ocean eventually knocked him off the boat, and he drowned, making it clear to the others that the currents were just too strong. Then, added to the anguish on board what was left of the ship, the next night another ship, the SS Bombay, passed so close to the wreckage that its engines could be heard clearly above the roaring waves. The screams and frantic waving from survivors, however, went unheard and unseen as the ship continued on its way, oblivious to the unfolding disaster. For the better part of 2 agonizing days, the survivors clung to the wreckage with no fresh water and only small scraps of food. On the rear section, a small piece of ham and a bag of almonds was discovered, but the survivors hesitated to eat the salty meat, fearing it would worsen their growing thirst. Meanwhile, every wave threatened to dislodge them from the rocks, and sharks could be seen circling ominously in the waters below, likely drawn to the bodies of those who had already drowned. In their desperate situation, eventually 2 sailors, John Leach and Robert Knapman, using fragments from the wreck, constructed a crude raft, binding the pieces with rope that they could salvage. The 2 men then set out battling wave after wave with nothing but their determination and raw strength. This would go on to take hours, but finally the raft reached the beach. Exhausted and nearly broken, the men then signaled to the survivors still clinging to the wreck, providing the first real spark of hope to those still stranded in the ocean. The 2 men then began the trek toward the Cape Northumberland lighthouse. This journey of 20 miles or 32 kilometers took them through swamps and over sandhills, but when dawn broke, they reached the lighthouse. After knocking on the door, they were met by keeper Ben Germain, who took them in and heard their story. Without hesitation, Ben knew he had to get help, but the lighthouse didn't have a telegraph. So instead, he took off on a horse to the post office in Mount Gambier. From there, telegraphs were sent carrying the urgent news of the wreck and the desperation of those still stranded at sea. News of the disaster then mobilized a steamer called Corio and a lifeboat known as Ladybird, but locating the wreck was no small task. In an era without precise communication or navigational aids, the exact position of the Adela remained uncertain, forcing rescue crews to comb the coastline. And to make things worse, the weather had worsened into a strong winter storm. Heavy swells and breaking waves complicated their approach, repeatedly preventing attempts to get close to the wreckage once it was finally spotted. Meanwhile, prior to its arrival, the survivors still aboard endured increasingly treacherous conditions. The cabins had been completely gutted by the ocean, forcing survivors to cling to the rigging or the steeply angled hull for refuge. Their thirst began to take its toll too, driving some to madness and others to fatal desperation. Several of those who remained simply allowed themselves to slip quietly into the sea, overcome by exhaustion. By the time the Corio finally arrived on Wednesday, August 10th, 5 days after the ship smashed into the reef, about 50 survivors remained clinging to the fragmented wreckage. And the scene was one of unimaginable suffering as survivors had endured freezing nights and non-stop waves to that point. They were now emaciated, battered, and soaked through, and they were forced to watch as repeated rescue attempts were pushed back by the conditions. It wasn't until the 8th day that conditions improved enough for the lifeboat to make a successful approach. Finally, one by one, the remaining survivors jumped or fell into the boat, clutching at their last chance to be saved. Once they were all aboard and heading to shore, the full scale of the ordeal came into complete view for the rescuers. One man named Hurdle Fisher was pulled from the wreckage, weighed 133 pounds at the start of the voyage, but by the time he was safely aboard the Portland, his body weight had dropped to an alarming 82 pounds. Tragically, a total of 89 lives were lost as a result of the shipwreck and rescue effort, as several rescuers gave their lives in the brave attempt to save those who were stranded. The survivors, only numbering 24, endured unimaginable conditions over 8 harrowing days in the wreckage. And the wreck of the SS Adela stands as the worst maritime disaster in southern Australian history. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you want to listen to the audio-only version of these videos, you can listen wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description. If you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.